Welcome to the Regulatory Transparency Project's 4th Branch podcast series. All expressions of opinion are those of the speaker.
Hello, and welcome to the Regulatory Transparency Project's 4th Branch podcast. Today, we're joined by J. Kennerly Davis. Ken is a member of the Regulatory Process Working Group. He's a member of the Executive Committee of the Administrative Law and Regulation Practice Group. Ken has over 45 years of experience in corporate management, public service, and the private practice of law, almost all of which has involved some aspect of the continually evolving electric power industry. In that industry, Ken has advised clients about or been responsible for matters relating to corporate and project finance, transmission and distribution system operations, corporate reconstructing and strategic planning, the valuation of corporate investment opportunities, regulatory compliance, electric market structuring, and the methodologies used to estimate the social costs and benefits of carbon emissions. Today, Ken is going to present an overview of electric industry regulation. He'll address how that regulation has changed in a fundamental way over the last 140 years. And he'll discuss what that change has meant for electric customers, large and small. Welcome, Ken. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Marie. It's wonderful to be here. And it's a pleasure and a great opportunity to have a chance to talk about the vitally important electric industry and how its regulation has changed, fundamentally changed, over the years. There are a lot of details, of course, in the regulation of the electric industry because it's so complex and it's so heavily regulated. But today, I'm going to focus on a basic structural change in regulation that has occurred and try to provide an overview of that change that puts the other details helpfully in context. Now let's start at the beginning. The first electric power generating station in the country was operated by Thomas Edison. He began operations in 1882 in Lower Manhattan to provide electric service over a relatively short distance to Wall Street and to the New York Times. It was a very small generating facility, very, very small by today's standards. It was built on a site measuring just 50 feet by 100 feet. And of course, a lot has changed since then. Electric service is now universal. It supports our economy and almost every aspect of our modern way of life. We have come a very, very long way from that first small station on Pearl Street in 1882.
We definitely have. I can't imagine not having electricity. My first question for you, Ken, is as the industry has grown and spread its operations across the country and throughout the economy, how has regulation of the industry changed?
Well, the legal and regulatory system for every industry providing any sort of good or service depends on the combination of technical, physical, economic, and political factors that define the essential nature of that industry and its product or service. Now, the factors that define the electric industry are quite distinct, and I'll summarize them before we get into the further questions about regulation. Now, electric power, unlike other forms of power, such as coal and gas, electricity, cannot be stored in any significant amounts for any significant period of time. The supply of electricity, produced and transmitted and distributed across the electric grid to customers, that supply must be kept in close balance with the continuously changing demand for electricity that those customers have over time, from minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day. And if supply is not kept in close balance with continuously changing demand, then the electric system can quickly become unstable and widespread blackouts can result. So power plants must run constantly, around the clock, continuously adjusting their output to precisely match demand. That's a very important characteristic of the product that we're talking about. Another one has to do with the fact that the production of electricity, the transmission of electricity along high voltage power lines, the ones with the big steel towers, and the lower voltage distribution of electricity along our streets to our shops and homes, all of this requires the construction, maintenance, and reliable operation of massive amounts of very expensive, long-lived capital equipment. The fossil-fueled, nuclear-fueled, and hydroelectric generating stations, the high-voltage transmission lines, substations, lower voltage distribution lines, control rooms, customer meters, service vehicles, and more, much more. For just one example of the extent of the physical assets involved, I'll cite an example in Virginia and the Carolinas, Dominion Energy. That company has about 6,800 miles of transmission lines and almost 89,000 miles of distribution lines to serve its 3.5 million customers. And they're not only extensive, they're long-lived. For example, transmission and distribution lines are designed to have a useful life of 30 to 50 years. And there's another factor, another characteristic of the business that's important to our understanding of the regulatory models that have developed and how changes can affect us as consumers. Given the essential nature of electric service, regulators have always been concerned with the availability, cost, and reliability of that service. And since the electric system now spans the whole continent, regulation has always involved some combination of local, state, and federal entities. The first combination of regulatory entities, I'll say the first regulatory model, emerged over time in the first half of the 20th century. It was state-centered, state-centric. It was a model at the state level, focused at the state level, that applied cost of service retail rate regulation.
So could you explain that term, and could you also describe the model?
Certainly. I mean, the industry, and it's not unique, but it certainly, if you look at the industry, there are a lot of terms that have developed to describe the physical and technical and regulatory components of the whole picture. Now, looking at the state-centric model applying cost of service retail rate regulation, fine, let's delve into that. While some electric power systems are owned and operated by government entities and some others by customer co-ops, for our overview for this discussion today, it's appropriate to focus on the private sector companies like Edison's Pearl Street venture and Dominion Energy. The private companies investor-owned, were typically vertically integrated corporations that combined the technical functions of generation, transmission, distribution, and customer service in one vertically integrated corporation under one management team. Now, given the significant amount of money required for such a venture, the technical requirement to deliver the electricity over a now extensive network of wires to customers, and the long-lived nature of the significant capital assets involved, given all of this, a political, legal, and economic consensus was soon reached as the industry started to expand that it would be enormously inefficient, wasteful for electric service corporations simply to compete for their customers. Significant investment lost on unsuccessful ventures, multiple transmission lines crisscrossing the countryside, multiple distribution lines on multiple sets of poles overhanging our sidewalks. No way. No way. So because of all its economic and technical characteristics, electrical service was quickly deemed to be what economists call a natural monopoly.
So I suppose a follow-up question then is, how did policymakers attempt to capture the economic efficiencies of a natural monopoly while avoiding the price and performance abuses associated with monopolies?
Well, that's a key question. The regulatory solution developed at the state level for a couple of reasons. Early transmission equipment was limited, very limited by today's standards, in its ability to efficiently transport power over any significant distance. The Edison system just transported it a few blocks. Also, the federal government was slow to assert regulatory authority. The Federal Power Act was first passed in 1920 to regulate the construction of hydroelectric facilities on navigable waters. It wasn't until 1935 that the act was amended to give the Federal Power Commission, now called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, give the commission authority to regulate the interstate transmission of electricity for wholesale power sales between electric companies. Not retail sales to end-use customers, but sales at the wholesale level from one electric company to another. Now, the Federal Commission has the authority and the responsibility to see that the prices charged by wholesale suppliers to their wholesale customers are, and this is the statutory term, just and reasonable. So for all of these reasons, technical and legal, the first developments of electric regulation were really not federal. They were preceded by important developments centered in the states.
So how did the state-centered model work?
Well, again, to capture, as you pointed out, the need was to capture the benefits of a natural monopoly without suffering the abuses that often occur with monopolies. And so what the state model did was have the commissions, a utility commission, a regulatory commission in each state, grant a single investor-owned corporation a monopoly franchise to provide electric service to all customers residing within a designated territory. They call it a service territory. but we can think also in terms of congressional districts, sort of. These are service territories for which the commission would grant a monopoly franchise. And as a part of that, the state commission would set and periodically adjust and reset the rates or the prices that the corporation could charge its franchise customers for electric service. And these are set by a process that had several steps. Upon application from the corporation for a certain level of prices or rates, and after an evidentiary hearing about those rates, the commission would set them at a level it determined to be adequate for the corporation to recover its reasonable costs and to provide a return to the corporation's investors that was adequate to attract the large amounts of capital needed to fund the construction, maintenance, and operation of the electric system. So the state commissions, they set rates at levels, prices at levels they determined to be just and reasonable and necessary and adequate to provide efficient, economic, reliable electric service, but no more, not higher. Now, the economic benefits to the corporation of having sort of locked in an adequate revenue stream for its monopoly franchise, the economic benefits came with a significant obligation. The obligation to serve. That is, the legal obligation is a part of its franchise grant, a legal obligation to plan for and design and construct and operate the facilities needed to provide reliable service to any home or any business in the territory that requested it, and to do that at the rates prescribed by the state commission. Under this model, the electric corporation couldn't pick or choose its customers, couldn't adjust its prices as a free market competitive corporation can, or decide that it was uneconomic to continue service. No, if it felt it needed more money to provide the mandated universal service to meet growing demand, the corporation could apply for a rate increase that the commission might or might not grant after an evidentiary hearing. And if the commission determined for a given period of time that the company was earning more than is required for reliable service, it could and often did cut rates. And ultimately, if a state corporation determined that an electric company was simply failing to fulfill its obligation to serve, then the commission could revoke the franchise. Thus, under this model, the investor-owned electric company became a rate-regulated, investor-owned electric utility company. This was the regulatory model, the deal, the compact, to ensure that management of the vertically integrated electric corporation was accountable to its customers through the oversight of the state commission. The obligation to serve was the linchpin of the state-based electric regulation model, and the virtual effective elimination of the obligation to serve is the major change, the fundamental change in electric regulation over the last 40 years or so. And I want to talk about that more as we go on.
So could you please explain how this happened?
Certainly, the state-based cost of service franchise model worked well for all parties for years. From the 30s through the 1960s, generator technology improved rapidly, bringing dramatic economies of scale. And because of those economies of scale, the next new power plant, typically coal-fired, was much bigger and much more efficient than its predecessors. Electric companies could therefore build more power plants to meet growing demand, recover their costs, earn more return on their increasing invested capital, and because of the increased economies of scale, go in and ask state commissions, to reduce their rates as this process unfolded. And of course, lower rates, lower prices encouraged more retail consumption and more revenue for the company's investors. It was for years a truly virtuous cycle of economics and regulation.
But my understanding is something happened to disrupt this mutually beneficial arrangement. Is this correct?
It sure did. It sure did, because as we transitioned from the 60s into the 70s, the country saw a dramatic increase in the stringency, complexity, and cost of environmental regulations. The EPA was established. Congress enacted the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and more. This explosion of regulation collided head-on with the development of ever larger electric generating plants. Permitting and construction took much longer than planned for and cost much more than was budgeted. Electric utilities began asking state commissions not for rate cuts, but for significant rate increases to cover their ballooning costs. And these requested rate increases put state commissions in a serious political bind with the customers whose interests the commissions were mandated by state law to protect. An increasing number of generating plant projects became so economic they couldn't even be finished. They had to be canceled. These cancellations triggered large losses for investors and sometimes large costs for customers. The economies of scale that justified larger and larger power plants vanished. And at the same time, as natural gas-fired generation technology improved, and it was improving rapidly, suddenly the next most economical plant for a company to build wasn't bigger, it was smaller than before, much smaller. And lo and behold, if generating plants were smaller and cheaper to build and operate, perhaps the thinking emerged. Perhaps the generation function was no longer a natural monopoly. Now, this thinking unfolded dramatically first in Great Britain. When Britain privatized its vertically integrated government electric sector in the 1980s, it unbundled generation assets from transmission and distribution assets and sold the different asset types to different purchasers. They did this with the idea that if generating plants was smaller and therefore cheaper to build, then the country's electric sector could be comprised of perhaps potentially a large number of independent individual generating companies selling their power wholesale to delivery companies comprised of transmission and distribution assets that would sell the power they purchased from generators on to end-use retail customers. This concept of unbundling generation assets from transmission and distribution delivery systems really caught the attention of the U.S. electric industry and policymakers. Wow! If traditional electric utilities could divest their generation, retain their transmission and distribution systems, and rely on independent generating companies to supply the power needed to meet retail customer demand, then the utilities, and very importantly, their state regulators, could avoid the significant economic and political risks that had come to burden the construction of large and ever more expensive utility-owned power plants. This risk avoidance, risk shifting the construction risk from rate-paying retail customers to the investors in non-utility independent generators, this risk shifting drove the unbundling dynamic in the utility industry in this country.
From what you just said, if generation is separated from rate-regulated utility companies, now comprised of delivery assets, how would you say is the price determined for the wholesale sale of power from the independent generators to, say, the delivery utility?
Well, this is a key part of the story. Recall that the Federal Power Act gives the Federal Power Commission, and now FERC, the authority to regulate wholesale electric sales and the responsibility to ensure that the prices charged by wholesale suppliers in those sales are just and reasonable. Now, for decades, FERC, the Federal Power Commission, and then FERC conducted cost of service rate setting proceedings like the state commissions to collect economic evidence and on the basis of that evidence set just and reasonable rates. But with the unbundling of generation and the proliferation of large numbers of independent suppliers, FERC concluded that the traditional kind of proceeding was too cumbersome, just too many to have separate cost of service rate proceedings for each wholesale supplier. Too cumbersome indeed. Instead, federal policymakers in this country, building on developments in Britain and to a great extent the theoretical work of American academics, American policymakers concluded that the wholesale price of electricity sold by independent suppliers to delivery utilities should be set by the operation of competitive wholesale markets for electricity. Now, FERC has a statutory duty to ensure that the wholesale rates are just and reasonable. Under the market approach, or once the regulator took this first step of saying these prices should be set by markets, then under the market approach, FERC will find particular rates to be just and reasonable if it first finds that the wholesale market in question is, in fact, competitive in its design, in its structure, and its operations. Now, the concept of competitive markets had great force in the 1980s. There were high hopes that competition among suppliers would lower costs, improve reliability, and encourage innovation. All the kind of benefits that markets often provide, competitive markets. But in this case, in this industry, the decision to use markets to set wholesale rates proved fateful, because the work to design markets, formulate the rules and procedures for markets in which a number of independent suppliers would compete to supply electricity. Electricity with all its distinctive technical characteristics, and supply it in the constantly varying amounts required to meet demand, and do all of that reliably and efficiently. This market design work turned out to be enormously complicated and frequently contentious.
And why is that?
Well, if generators are not simply and no longer a part of a single vertically integrated corporation led by one management group, and the generators, the independent generators, are not part of an electrically integrated physical system, the grid, then voluminous rules must be developed to accomplish a lot of things, including one, for example, ensure that all generators have equal competitive access to the electric transmission system. After all, that's what we're trying to accomplish here. Competition, fair competition. So there need to be rules to ensure that all generators have equal and open access to the transmission system. And two, rules need to be developed to conduct the studies, the technical studies, to identify the equipment, the electrical equipment needed to reliably and safely physically connect the generator to the grid. And three, rules need to be developed to allocate the cost of the interconnection equipment between the transmission owner and the independent generator. And four, rules are also needed to provide, once generators are connected, for the coordinated operation and maintenance of generators and the transmission and distribution system. Because remember, the whole thing has to be kept continuously in precise balance between supply and demand, so you can't have generators deciding to supply one day and then closing their plant for maintenance without notice and all the rest. There have to be rules for the coordinated operation of the whole system once the generators are connected. And finally, there need to be rules about money. Because remember, these are separate, independent operators connecting each of them separately, one at a time, to the transmission system to sell their products and services. There need to be rules and mechanisms to figure out the compensation that the generators will get for all the products and services they supply. Now, in practice, the compensation mechanism is basically a series of what they call reverse auctions, in which the transmission and distribution system utilities will announce how much power they need, and the generators will offer that power in different amounts at different prices, and then they'll do that in an auction. And the auction manager will select For the transmission utilities, the transmission and distribution utilities, the auction manager will select the cheapest collection of competing suppliers based on the bids, the offers they have made at different prices. They'll select, the system auction manager will select the group of suppliers that supply enough power at the lowest cost, at least in theory. That's how it works. But there are auctions and mechanisms for multiple products, all the products and services that generators supply.
So there are multiple products and services.
Well, yes. Now remember, electricity itself, that's the basic product. There is electricity itself that the generator actually delivers. But there is also generating capacity, the maximum amount of electricity that a generator could deliver at a time if demand required production and delivery. This capacity or capability for a generator has separate and additional economic value apart from the value of the electricity itself. And there are also a host of what the industry calls ancillary services. That's a bundle of technical functions that the generator performs by adjusting its equipment to help keep the overall electric grid continuously balanced and stable in the way it needs to be to avoid a blackout. Now, each one of these differing products and services, that is, the electricity, the capacity, and ancillary services, each one of these must be covered by its own set of rules and separate compensation mechanisms. And in an unbundled electric system, under this market approach, all of these rules for interconnection and cost allocation, the reverse auctions, and all of the rest, if you look at them together, the rules run to thousands of pages filled with complex mathematical formulas to determine the timing, terms, conditions, and compensation for all of these separate products and services.
And my follow-up question to that is, how are these rules and procedures developed?
Well, that adds to the complexity, the process to develop them. Now, some of the rules have been developed by FERC in rulemaking proceedings, notice and comment, final agency action, possible litigation. Some of the rules come from FERC, but others began their development. Others are developed kind of from the ground up by groups of market participants themselves, that is, the generators, the transmission and distribution utilities, state regulators, environmental interest groups, customer interest groups, attorneys general, and a host of other stakeholders, all of them laboring under the coordinated oversight of so-called independent system operators, that is, independent transmission system operators. These operators, these ISOs or ISOs, are creations of FERC policy as a part of the move from rate proceedings to market rates. The operators, the ISOs, they own no assets, but they operate the electric system in real time from a central control center, and they administer the generator interconnection process and the other voluminous rules developed by market participants. They operate independently of market participants to ensure that open transmission access for generators that is so necessary for free and effective competition. But it's quite a process. The technical, economic, and legal representatives of all the market participants, they work continually in different technical committees and subcommittees and working groups to draft rules for all of the steps in the process, and then actually put them to a vote of the market participants. All the market participants get a vote. And if the proposed rules or rule changes have majority support from the different market participants, and believe me, the different market participants have greatly different economic interests. But if a consensus, an adequate consensus, can be reached and a majority vote of approval achieved, then the rules developed by the market participants in the process administered by the ISO are submitted to FERC for approval as rules, if the Commission determines this, as rules that in fact support a competitive market. This process, this so-called market participant governance process, is extremely complex, extremely costly, and very time-consuming and contentious. For just one example, generator interconnection procedures and related interconnection cost allocation issues have been discussed, argued about, and if you look across the country, litigated for years without lasting resolution. Now, to get a better feel for this, I encourage any interested listeners to go to the website of one of the ISOs. They're across the country. For example, there's the Midwest ISO or MISO, M-I-S-O. There's the California ISO or Cal-ISO. There's the New York ISO or NISO. Go to the website and it's all there. The FERC-approved market rules called a tariff, along with a long list of thick technical procedural manuals, a list of the different market participants from the different sectors, and the list you'll see can run to the scores of individual entities. And you'll also see the status of governance proceedings, the next technical committee meeting or the next vote, and the status of FERC proceedings and litigation, and a lot more. But that's the real place to get a picture of the complexity of this model of regulation that I've been describing. Now I want to close with a focus on the market rules that calculate the compensation to be paid generators, the suppliers. Remember I said they run auctions, reverse auctions, to secure the amount of power needed for a time, secure it from the suppliers for the transmission and distribution utilities. They run these auctions. And the design and structure of these auction rules are very very important and very complex, as I have sought to describe. But all the rules are designed to provide compensation that is sufficient for the generator to independently determine that the compensation is sufficient, it is enough, it's adequate to support their independent decision to actually participate in the market and supply products and services. For each independent generator, each independent supplier, it's an elective decision. The suppliers have no legal obligation to participate, no obligation to serve like the traditional state-regulated, vertically integrated utility did. Now, the transmission and distribution utilities still do have an obligation to serve their retail customers. But those utilities are now dependent upon suppliers who do not have the same obligation. Generators may or may not participate at the time and at the level needed. In fact, this unbundling and the elective nature of the supply function has led to a number of crisis situations of supply shortfall in times of very hot or very cold weather. And aside from severe weather crises, it has led to a continuing level of concern that markets may not operate dependably to produce the reliable, cheap power we need in the amounts we need. Now, this discussion, and a lot of this, most of it, I guess, is in the trade press and legal journals, but some listeners may have also seen it in the general press. This concern of observers, commentators, and officials responsible for reliability has led to actually a growing level of concern about supply adequacy. And the answer has been largely to go back to the compensation mechanisms and work to change those, refine those, and improve those. So in the next cold snap or heat wave, the generators show up in the amount and at the time needed. But it's not like the old system where generation was simply part of a corporation that had a legal obligation to show up. It's a matter of now trying to design a very complicated market auction-based system to provide the money that will incent the generators to supply. And besides supply concerns, there's also a continuing concern if you look at the market participant governance process, where rules reflect the compromise voted on, negotiated, log-rolled result of a dynamic debate, discussion, dialogue, arguments back and forth and among large numbers of entities with greatly different economic interests and positions and agendas. There's a concern that this process, this legislative process, this governance process, may not be producing the results, the rules, the technical procedures that optimize the efficiency and reliability of the electric system in the way that efficiency and reliability was optimized under the integrated company state-regulated cost of service model And so, as a result of all this, perhaps it's time to refocus on the differences between this federal-centric, unbundled market model and the traditional state-centered integrated cost of service model, and take a fresh, clear-eyed look and make a new determination about which approach, or some new approach, is in the best interests of consumers and the best interests of our overall economy as we approach the midpoint of the 20th century. It's been years as this story has 21st century. It's been years since this story began, and it's not at all finished. I have just scratched the surface and laid out some very general, very basic markers that I hope interested parties and observers find useful when they consider or read the next general press story about a supply shortfall or a widespread blackout. They'll have a better feel, I hope, for what happened and why it happened.
And on that note, for someone who kind of wants to learn more about the electric industry, what kind of book recommendations or further reading recommendations do you have?
Well, as I say, I've just scratched the surface. But a start for additional reading would include a few basics. There, fellow Charles Phillips wrote a book called The Regulation of Public Utilities, and it's an extensive and well-written description of the traditional cost of service model. A fellow named Robert Poole wrote a book entitled Unnatural Monopolies. I think that title sort of describes its focus. And then there's an organization, Public Utilities Reports. They have written a book called The Electric Industry in Transition, and another one called Competition in Electricity. And again, both of those titles, I think, are self-explanatory. Paul Joskow, that's Joskow, has written Markets for Power, again, a self-descriptive title. And to go back to the early days, Matthew Josephson, 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 has written a book titled simply Edison, which is a great discussion. It's a biography, but also a great discussion of the early days of the industry and its fascinating first phases of development.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for speaking on the subject of regulation in the electric industry. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today. It was wonderful speaking to you today, Ken.
Well, thank you for having me. It is a greatly important subject for all of us. We're all consumers. We all depend on electricity. I mean, just recall the last time the lights went out. I think it benefits everyone to understand how we got here and what's behind the switch.
Yes. Where would we be without electricity? All right. Have a good day.
On behalf of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project, thanks for tuning in to the Fourth Branch podcast. To catch every new episode when it's released, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spreaker. For the latest from RTP, please visit our website at regproject.org. That's regproject.org.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.